This week on the agenda, Understanding China. We speak to the man who knows better than most how to best do business with the world's most populous nation, Tim Clissold. For many businesses looking to expand overseas, China is a market too large to resist. But many Western companies need something of a helping hand to succeed in the world's biggest single market. And when they do, many will turn to Tim Clissold, the man who co-founded one of the first private equity groups ever launched in China and wrote the bestseller Mr. China, detailing that group's ups and downs. Tim joins me now here in the studio. Great to see you here.
Thank you.
In person.
Thank you.
You've been in love with China for decades now. What first drew you to it?
Well, so I've been in love with it, but it's quite frustrating love. So I was actually sent to Hong Kong in the 1980s, and I don't know why, but I just immediately was struck by the difference in the language. And I can't explain why, but every time I see a character, I wanted to know what it meant, and I was just really intrigued. And that kind of led me to want to explore China. So I think I was only in Hong Kong for about 3 weeks before I made my first trip to Guangzhou. And, that first trip to China basically changed my life because it felt like I was going back 50 years. I mean, there's hardly any internal combustion engines, hardly any lights on the street. It was just so different and so strange. And a planned economy, I just got really intrigued by it.
And back in those days,
Yeah.
How do you think the West viewed the country? Because it sounds like you were quite surprised with what you found.
I don't think they did view it at all. I don't think people generally had any impression of China other than the kind of stereotypes of, sloping roofs and inscrutable people, which of course they're not at all. Everyone wearing uniform clothing, red flags, that was about as far as it went. So it hadn't really impinged on the Western consciousness at that time. So all the people who came to see me in China would arrive with a just completely blank sheet of paper, having no idea what to expect.
And things have changed a lot, but back then you made a huge life-changing decision and you decided to up sticks, go out there, live and study.
So it's life-changing in retrospect. So when I actually did it, I was just following my nose and my interests. So, I was very interested in China. I wanted to understand language. Why not study it? And then things kind of just took off from then. So it's not all pre-planned. Very few people's lives are.
So there wasn't a light bulb moment when you thought, China's the future?
Yes, well, there was. Because what then happened was I took about 3 months out of work and I travelled through Xinjiang I went to Pakistan over the Karakoram Mountains through Xinjiang and then right the way through central China to Chongqing and then along the Yangtze on a boat up through, from Shanghai, Beijing, through outer Mongolia and then right the way back through Russia.
And to be clear, this wasn't for work, this was you travelling and
work.
exploring.
Yes, it was exploring, yeah. And the thing that really struck me was the contrast between China and Russia. And when I got back to the UK, all the newspapers were full of perestroika and glasnost because it was the great Gorbachev years. And I just felt that was the wrong way round. And there's just so much more energy and vibrance in China. So that was actually the light bulb moment. It was coming back here and seeing that kind of most of my colleagues and friends' lives hasn't changed, and mine had just changed so much. And then this contrast between Russia and China, and I just felt the general opinion in the West had got that one wrong, and when the market gets something wrong, that's a big opportunity.
And yet still, investors, policymakers get it wrong when it comes to China. Why do you think that is? Well,
because they are extremely time-constrained, and China's difficult and it's complicated. So it's much easier if you just go back to things that are familiar, like a stereotype. So the biggest mistake people make is conflating Soviet communism with Chinese communism. It's a totally different animal. And I think the best way of thinking about the way that China is governed is it's an extension of the imperial system. So the bureaucrats now are a bit like the scholar officials in the imperial times, and they have the same ethics. It's very important to understand the ethic behind what Chinese officialdom is trying to do. And I just think it's too difficult. So people don't really take the time to understand that China does play by its own rules. And then it's also extremely difficult to really believe that an entire society does play by different rules unless you've been there and made mistakes and found out that it's really true. It's very difficult to learn it just from, vicariously, just from people telling you about it. You have to feel it, you have to be there to really understand that it is different.
And you have felt it, and you have been there. In fact, you wanted to found a private equity group in China. Tell us a little bit about that.
So that was in the early 90s, and I met someone who'd been on Wall Street for a long time, and he'd identified China as kind of the next wave in the movement of capital. And I was very much his junior. He was about 12 years older than me. But we teamed up, and I was meant to be the guy who'd kind of get all the stuff done in China, and he'd go out and raise the money. And he did that in about 6 weeks. I think he went back to America and came back with 158 million US dollars, and basically just said, get on with it. So that was, as I'm sure you can imagine, quite a challenge.
Didn't quite go to plan, did it?
Didn't quite go to plan. And that was, going back to your early question, that was because we'd assumed that businesses work in the same way in China as they do in the West. So, contracts enforceable, which is true, but it's not so simple. And that, incentives work in the same way, and they don't. So there are all sorts of differences that we learned, and took quite a lot of knocks and bruises, during that process.
And that was despite you having slept and breathed China,
yes,
culture, and the business way of life.
Well, I hadn't really done a lot of business in China by that stage, and frankly, there were very few Westerners who, at that stage, really did understand the differences, because most of the investments that had been made by foreign investors are large corporations, so they're just a small offshoot of a much larger thing that was outside. We'd basically raised this money, and we eventually came up with something like 420 million. All of that was invested in China. We had no foreign head office. We had no foreign activities. We were a Chinese company, so that was very, very different in those days.
So talk us through the early days, because you had that enormous investment and then you watched it slowly trickle away.
So basically what happened is we invested in, I think, something like 20 factories, and we invested that in something like 18 months. And on paper, we had controlling positions, so we always took more than 50% of the equity. We always had the right to send in management. But there was a slow realisation that, although on paper we had the controlling interest, we weren't actually in control. So there are all sorts of things that happened, like unauthorised investments, where a factory manager would basically invest a vast amount of money in a new factory for a new product without really ever consulting.
And that was okay?
No, it wasn't okay. Of course it wasn't okay. But once it's happened, then you've got the dilemma of what you do. And some of these factories were in quite sort of remote places. So it was tough then to get replacement managers to go. So it was very difficult. And the other thing which is really came home is that we were subject to fraud, which is about $5 million US. There was a letter of credit fraud in the south of China. And through that, I learned that a corporate action in China can be validated entirely by the affixing of a chop. So there are these little round red seals, and if that chop is affixed, then that is complete proof of validity of corporate action. So there's nothing you can do to remove that. So, so what that means is that physical custody of the chop is absolutely critical. So it's very simple in China. If you don't control the chop, you can't control the business, and that's still going on now. So companies like ARM have just had a major problem with their subsidiary in China, and that's because the Chinese counterparty had physical control of the chop, but there's very, very little you can do about it. So it's still going on. 20 years later, people still haven't learnt that really basic rule.
You and your colleagues lost a lot of money. The business lost a lot of money. How then did you turn things around? So
we basically, we used to value the businesses, and the valuation of the business was way down from what we paid for it. So although, on paper, it was a paper loss, but and there was cash that had outflowed, but it was retrievable. We still had, valid businesses. The problem was we weren't in control. We had all these different factories going their different ways, and what we needed to do was pull it all together. And the way that we did that was to try to create a common sort of culture that both the foreigners and the Chinese could buy into. And that took quite a long time to do, but it was quite successful. It was surprisingly successful. You just have to be very clear about what you're trying to achieve, how everyone can benefit, and what kind of values you're trying to inscribe in the business. So once you've accepted that framework, if people don't subscribe to that value, then basically you have to get rid of them. So there was a process of just setting up the values and the objectives we wanted to do, and then if people really couldn't sign on to that, then you had to change them, and that was very arduous, very tough, and that involved a lot of fights.
So it wasn't just a question of being nimble and being flexible. You had to roll your sleeves up and get quite stuck in.
In some ways, it was the opposite.
Yeah.
So you have to listen very, very carefully to the people that you're working with and managing to find something that is both acceptable to a Western side and to a Chinese side. And once you've done that, then everybody binds on. And if you take your time and you really understand, it's not that difficult. It's not that.
It's not that difficult, but in business, time is money. But
Yes, that's right. That's right. So the overall performance of the business, the companies are still the largest independent producer of auto components in China. So it's still, it has survived and it's been bought and sold several times. The problem with the early part is you're exactly right. There's kind of a relentless cutting into your returns just by the effluxion of time. And it did take about 3 or 4 years to really fully understand what the depth of the problems were and then figure out how to turn it around. So obviously in those earlier years, the returns weren't there.
So then you became a bit of a turnaround guy and became involved in resolution disputes. Talk to us a little bit about that, the relationship between Chinese and foreign companies. Give us an example of what that looks like.
So what I wanted to do is try and take the experience that I'd had of resolving a set of disputes, because there were American investors in this private equity company, mainly American investors and Chinese business people, and there were just different objectives. So I was stuck in the middle, and by kind of rejecting a lot of the very fixed Western views, I did manage to solve it ultimately, and I wanted to use that that problem-solving skill in different contexts. So there are a huge number of disputes between foreign investors and Chinese, and they're generally because there are misunderstandings, and then the foreigners feel that they're being taken advantage of inside China, and that can be because they don't understand the system, or it can be because they are being taken advantage of. But it then generally becomes tremendously emotional. So every time I go to do a dispute resolution, I'm always appointed by the foreign side, and I go and speak to the Chinese party. And basically, the first meeting, the Chinese guy will just shout for 3 hours. Okay, so then you go back the next day and he'll shout for 2 hours, and then eventually you'll sort of sort it out. And it's the same on the American side. So basically, the Americans feel that guy's stolen our money because he has not adhered to the contract. So that's one side. And then the other side is those guys have insulted our national dignity by treating us in that way. Okay? So then you just gradually kind of work, and you get both sides to say, well, do you want to sort this out? And they generally sort of grumble a lot and say yes. And then the next part is the most difficult, because you have to get both sides to accept emotionally that they were part of the problem. That's the most difficult part of it. If you can do that, then the rest of it all just comes down to numbers, and it's easy.
Now, something else a lot of people are shouting about in the business world and beyond is climate change, is going green. But back in 2008, you established a new business to originate carbon offsets. It seems a little bit ahead of its time. In China as well, which was accused of being one of the biggest polluters and contributors to CO2 emissions. So how's that going?
So, well, there are a lot of questions in that single question. So my interest in carbon offsets actually derived from a dispute that I resolved. So I didn't really understand the carbon offset business. And basically what I like in China is complexity. So anything that's like kind of really difficult and other people don't want to go anywhere near.
You like the challenge.
I like that, yeah. So So yeah, so we set up a business to originate carbon offsets, and I did feel it was a good thing. I did a lot of reading up about the physical science basis of climate change because I've taken a lot of money, again, from US investors. I wanted to know it was on solid ground. And ultimately, unfortunately, that scheme, which is put up by the UN, didn't work because the EU market for carbon offsets didn't work because the EU couldn't get its policy together. But I think one point that I would like to make is that China is a large polluter, but they are making the most incredible efforts to clear the environment up. So there's, last time I looked, there are 250 gigawatts of wind power and 250 gigawatts of solar power in China. Just to put that in context, the whole of the UK national grid is 70. So you've got more than 3 times the UK national grid in each of those renewables, and hydro is the same. And they're also doing that in the environment. So just a quick anecdote, there's a town in Shandong that I have been going to regularly recently. And when I first went there, it was terribly polluted because it is a base for the chemicals industry. And the local mayor tried to shut down one of the factories. And he tried to shut it down, he couldn't shut it down because the factory lobbied the provincial government and then he lobbied the central government. It was all completely mess. So he tried to shut it down and he couldn't, so he's fired. So then there was another guy helicoptered in from another local town called Zhaozhuang, and he tried to cut turn the chemical factory off and stop the pollution, and failed again. So he sent in the military police to blow up the power supply to that factory whilst it was working, so that all the vitreous substrates would freeze solid inside the reactors, so they'd never be able to start it up again. That's the level of the struggle that's going on. Because there are 6,000 people without work, it's not a simple issue to just shut down all these old smoke-creating industries. There is an enormous struggle underway in China, and they are succeeding. They are succeeding.
Hold that thought for now.
Yes.
We're going to take a short break,
That's
but
fine.
still to come here on the agenda. The art of the deal, why a knowledge of poetry could be key to unlocking success in the Chinese market.
Roger, repeat loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Welcome back to The Agenda. More now with my guest, China expert Tim Clissold. Tim, let's talk about the current relationship between China and the West. Where do you think that relationship's headed?
I'd like to say I was optimistic it'll be sorted out, but it's very difficult to see how it will be. And so I'm not terribly optimistic. I think that hot conflict will probably be managed, but I think we're going to see a lot more decoupling, and that can't possibly be for the benefit of the world. So I'm not really terribly optimistic about it, I'm afraid.
Well, we can't talk about China and not talk about COVID, and particularly all of the supply chain issues that has thrown up and caused. Do you think we can expect further lockdowns in China, and if so, what the implications are going to be when it comes to global supply chains?
I think that because you can't avoid the risk of that happening, there is going to be a continuing decoupling. I mean, I think that any prudent businessman will do two things. So the first one is that they will try and protect their supply chains, but they can't ignore the Chinese market. So, the idea that there will be, a full decoupling, I think, is unrealistic. And the reason why I think that is because, basically, whether it's true or not, most people in China believe that the United States wants to hold back China's development. Okay, so let's not get into the reasons why that's happening, but that's what they believe. And you can't do that to any nation. You can't say you don't have the right to develop in the way that you wish. And it's not practical to expect that to happen. So I think that what will happen is that gradually over a period of time, there will be more and more tension inside the West about a uniform China strategy, because A, I don't think it will work, and B, it's not in anybody's interests to have a complete decoupling. What we need to do is have more talk, recognise the areas where we've got different interests from China, but there are all sorts of areas where we've got very common interests as well. And I think we just need to try and lower the temperature of the language, and the West has a tremendous catch-up. When Wen Jiabao came to see David Cameron, he brought with him a copy of Adam Smith's, not The Wealth of Nations, the most famous one, with the moving hand. He brought The Theory of Moral Sentiment, and he quoted from it at length, right? And the theory of moral sentiment is about the limits that should be placed on the market. Xi Jinping made a speech in France in 2014 saying, as a young man, I studied Montesquieu, Voltaire and Rousseau, and through that I understood that progress in the mind propels progress in society. So there aren't really any Western leaders that could possibly say, as a young man I read Confucius and Mengzi and Xunzi. I mean, that just doesn't exist. So there is objectively a tremendous catch-up that the West has, and we haven't even started that. And I think it's really imperative that we have to try to understand that other societies can live by their own historical experience and their own traditions and so on quite successfully and quite happily. They don't just have to adopt a Western model. And I think that that's one of the biggest blocks that we have in trying to deal with China.
And that's also why you're quite invested, aren't you, in education and changing the system in terms of that. You want to get British school children learning the history of China, not just the language, in the way that they know about ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians.
That's right. So at the moment, in my view, the education system in the UK, which, there are lots of marvellous things about it, has adapted amazingly for, say, biology, so that now the biology A-level includes molecular genetics. It didn't exist when I did A-level. Geography includes climate change, it includes dispute resolution with, sort of hunger and all these issues. But the biggest change in my lifetime is globalization and the internationalization of the way that we all think and work. And the largest player in that is China. And China is effectively completely absent from the A-level curriculum. So there are some people who study Mandarin at A-level, but they're basically a tiny, tiny minority, and 90% of them are PRC nationals. So for a non-native speaking Brit who wants to try and understand China, there's effectively not really anything at this critical phase at A-levels. And what I would like to do is introduce a new qualification that is about the Chinese civilization, which is taught in English by English people for English people. And I think that is something that can unite both the hawks and the doves on China, because whatever your view about China is, it's not going to go away, and we have to deal with it. So even if you think it's kind of an adversary that has to be pushed away, or somebody that we need to cooperate with best, we need to understand it better. So that's my pitch.
And to understand it better, we need to look at old Chinese texts, learn about Chinese history. You've immersed yourself in poetry.
Yeah, I have. So part of the reason why I've tried to write about Chinese poetry and use that as a genre to try and bridge the gap is because the efforts to try and change the education system are very, very long term, and time just doesn't wait. So basically what I've done is I've assembled a collection of poems which were written in the 7th, 8th, 9th century by Chinese poets, which are very, very well known in China, but they speak to all the problems that we have in the West at the moment, like homelessness, inequality, tax evasion, deforestation,
So all of that was going on then?
So all of that was going on then. So there's one poem which I found I was thrilled with by Liu Zongyuan, and that is about the problems that come from excessive logging. Yeah, and that was written in about 930. So I think it's very heartening that a lot of these problems are the same as they were. So Du Fu, China's greatest poet, the most famous poem Du Fu wrote, you can immediately see him as a troubled, lonely man standing on the walls of a shattered city, looking out over a ravaged landscape, and he's just desperate for news from home because he's a refugee. Yeah, and how topical can that be in Europe at the moment?
So writing about poetry, even though it's not your standard business book, actually just tie all your themes together.
I just hope it can make people realise that we've got a lot more in common than we have set apart, and they can sort of think, well, yeah, that is pretty amazing that the Chinese were thinking about these problems so long ago.
But you've been on a bit of a journey yourself to get to this point, and now you want to, to share your knowledge. But
Yeah.
I'm thinking in 2018, you retraced a lot of your steps, didn't you? And you went to some of China's most remote areas. Talk us through the route you took, why you did it, and what changes you saw.
Okay, so I actually went to Kyrgyzstan, and I went into Xinjiang, because I'm deeply interested in what's going on in Xinjiang, and I didn't really believe what I was reading in the Western press. So I wanted to go and see for myself. And obviously there are a lot of issues in Xinjiang that we could talk about separately. But the thing that made the biggest impression on me is the first time I went, which is 30 years ago, there were basically no roads, certainly no railways to Kashgar. So I got on a train in Kashgar, and just outside the town, I was in a wind farm. So I slept overnight in this train, and I woke up and I was in the same wind farm. And I spent the whole of the rest of the day in a wind farm, and then the next night. So this wind farm it just goes mile after mile after mile after mile. Most of them were working. That's where you get the 250 gigawatts of wind power from. So when you have a tremendous, pressing, complex problem, there are lots of different ways to tackle it. But the Chinese way of tackling it is from a single top-down mind pushing through a practical strategy, okay? And that really gets stuff done. That really gets stuff done. So if you want to be convinced that there is a role for some pretty tough, decision-making at the top of the government about climate change, go and have a look at Xinjiang.
And if you could do that journey again in another 30 years, what would you expect to see?
Well, it's difficult to know, isn't it? I mean, another decarbonisation, which is very, very important to understand, is the high-speed trains in China, because they've totally transformed life in China. So, I remember back in the 80s, I went to Qingdao for a meeting, and, we flew, stayed overnight, flew back, right? Just before COVID, when I was in China, I went to Qingdao for a meeting. I just got up at 7 o'clock in the morning, got the high-speed train, had the meeting, came back on the train. So basically, the train is completely overtaking the need for medium haul flights. So that's an enormous contribution to decarbonisation. So I suspect that if I did that same journey in 30 years' time, it would probably be on a high-speed train. So
trains, technology, and talking, that's the future.
Yeah.
Tim Clissold, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and hearing your stories. Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, as the conflict in Ukraine keeps food prices soaring, how might the world feed itself in future? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all of the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.